I think Zoom rooms should come with a background music, like a waiting music, like a call waiting sort of thing. It just automatically gets triggered before you start a session. Oh,
Okay,
there's a good
Jared's
one.
ready.
Four. I'm ready. Are we still waiting? I don't know.
That was so nice. I got hypnotized. We should probably dive on in, eh, John? What do you think?
Okay, well, friends, welcome. I am, yeah, it's really lovely to see all of your faces on Zoom. I am John, uh, and this is Sam. For those of you who might not know him, we have a bit of a slideshow to go through, and I think that the way to do this might be to take time to turn the slideshow on as we go, and then turn it off when there are points for discussion. Um, to begin with, we wanted to start by welcoming you all and to this conversation about podcasting. Tonight, we're going to talk about uh, what makes podcasts, well, how to make a podcast, what makes them listenable, and how you can make a podcast that will be great. Just looking around the room, you're all great already. And so it's just about, I was going to say bottling that, but instead it's about recording that into a format that can then be posted on some sort of online platform and other people can then consume it. So there are no bottles involved, just bytes of information and various other subscription requirements. Before we begin, and there are few enough of us here to, we'll go around and do a bit of an intro, but we wanted to start by recognizing that no matter where we are gathered, whether it is in Guelph or Grey and Bruce or Sky, I think you're in Godridge, and or Kitchener Waterloo. I'll just keep guessing. Okay, or KW, that wherever we are gathered, to share this information about storytelling and creation and connection, we are gathered on land where people have been creating art and gathering and sharing stories since time immemorial. Specifically, for those of us in Grey and Bruce counties, we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. The people of the Three Fires Confederacy, which include the Odawa, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, whose long and continuing history has a lot to teach us. Those communities represented today by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation at Saugeen First Nation and the unceded Chippewas of Nawash up at Nayashingaming. We also recognize the Métis Nation of Ontario. And by virtue of being in this place, we are all treaty people, with all the rights and responsibilities and relations that entails. Sam, I don't know enough about territories on which you are living and broadcasting. Where are you?
I'd love to, if I can share my screen just to show the slide we have about this as well. I'm just going to start the slideshow here. So this is my acknowledgement is about being on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, where Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people continue to thrive. And I try to make practical actions as often as I can to respect the Indigenous people that live and thrive in my community and support reconciliation in practical ways. And we thought, because this is a podcast workshop, there are so many great podcasts by Indigenous creators out there. We just put a few of them up on the screen, including The Secret Life of Canada, that's through the CBC. It's a great educational podcast. There's Coffee with My Ma, which is, I just discovered this recently, but great colloquial Indigenous stories, a very charismatic host. And then John recommended Media Indigena to me recently, which I hadn't heard. But
as we work to amplify Indigenous and First Nation voices, one way to do that is by making sure that we make space for them in our lives and in our listening habits. and podcast playlists. So as we begin, I'm John. I am one of the hosts of Georgian Bay Roots. One of the other hosts is sitting on the middle of your screen there. Kaylee is waving. You all know this, but we'll say this for the recording. Georgian Bay Roots is the official radio show of the Summerfolk Music and Crafts Festival. We're a 1-hour show where every week we share the music being made and played in Grey and Bruce counties, as well as mixing in folk and roots music from across Canada and around the world. To provide a platform for that kind of music. We are on the radio. We're also on Blues and Roots Radio online and as a podcast. Specifically through SoundCloud or at summerfolk.org/Georgian Bay Roots. And we started that podcast in 2016, I believe.
So John's a bit more seasoned than I am. I started Lyrically Speaking back in 2018. I was also on the various campus radio shows before that. But Lyrically Speaking is a show where musicians of all stripes discuss their lyrics, the stories behind their songs, and their relationships with language. So I started this show essentially as a platform to give a lot of up-and-coming Canadian creators, both within folk and within different genres, the opportunity to have their first long-form interview. I felt it was really important to invite guests who might not be ready for a shorter interview on a more established platform, but still had so much to talk about in their lyrics and their songs. So I've been running this out of CFRU here in Guelph for a couple of years. And
there are so many kinds of podcasts. There are, and we're going to talk about those. I'm wondering if this would be a good time though to just kind of go through who is in the room and hear a little bit more about what made you want to sign up for this particular workshop. Let's maybe start with Kaylee and Mike and Jeffrey.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Kaylee. Jeffrey's here. Michael will join us shortly. I am one of the hosts of Georgian Bay Roots, and I'm always interested in ways that I can improve the show from what it is that I get to offer every 4 weeks. I love doing Georgian Bay Roots, and I've learned a lot. I've been a host since when, John? 2017, late 2017, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while. So I've got some experience under my belt, but I'm always interested in learning new tricks of the trade. I've recently upgraded all of my equipment, so I'm hoping to produce a crisper sounding show. And yeah, just looking to kind of learn whatever I can.
Awesome. Welcome.
That's great.
Preetam.
Hi, everybody. My name's Preetam. I am also in Guelph, like Sam is. And I signed up for this because I'm a fan of both John and Sam as humans. And I thought a chance to interact with them at the same time in a Zoom would be kind of fun. I have never been a podcaster. I don't actually even listen to a lot of podcasts. But I'm interested in the medium, and I'm interested to see where it might fall in the scope of all of the things that I like to do.
That's great.
Awesome.
Thank you for
Welcome.
coming, Preetam.
And for saying nice things about us. Kimmer and Jarrett and family member.
This is Harley. She was the one having the aforementioned doggy date. She is a happy puppy now, although she's still raring to go. It wasn't long enough. I actually do listen to a lot of podcasts, and I have for a long, long time. I was a talk radio fan in the 90s, and podcasts have kind of taken over from talk radio for me, although I still listen to CBC. I have been interested in doing a podcast for a long time. The problem always seems to be I come up with an idea and there's already several out there doing it. So then I just start listening to them and then I forget about doing one myself. But I really want to learn, what makes a good podcast. Basically, and it's a broad question. I know that, but I have some ideas. But I'd love to hear from people who do it.
Well, that's amazing. Well, you're in the perfect spot. And yeah, can't wait to talk about all the different elements and hopefully help.
And I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. The occasional time I do. I have ideas for podcasts that I think could be fun to do, but I'm unsure of how to even begin getting it going. Also, with my role with Youth Discoveries, I want to be able to help to point people in a good direction. If they're interested in doing anything like that, or they want to get onto some of our more local podcasts to share their music and their experiences, I'd like to be able to help connect them to people like yourself, Sam, or to you, John, so that they can have those kind of experiences as well, and just have another resource available for them in their toolkit. So, and Harley doesn't like podcasts. She doesn't really like phones. She just wants bones and to play a lot. So she is currently chewing on her bone and ignoring us right now.
Yeah, most bones won't update to download the latest podcast software. So that's
no, there's like no Bone 2.0 available. It's not there. So.
I'll mute this so that everybody doesn't have to listen to her chew on the phone.
Oh, that's great hearing why everybody's here. That's a whole host of great reasons that y'all attended. And I'll boot up the
there are
again and we'll
so
get talking.
On Apple Podcasts alone, Apple being like the company that we are all familiar with for their technology and various platforms, Apple lists more than 500,000 podcasts. By other website counts, there are more than 800,000 podcasts that are being made currently. And there are tons and tons of people listening to them. There are podcasts about everything. Sam found in searching for podcasts that might be a little more niche, a list of the top 15 coin podcasts you must follow. You're definitely going to get your money's worth, even on something that's so specific. And there are podcasts about everything. There are, and because of that, you could create a podcast about anything. There are different formats to meet the different needs and focuses that you might want. There are interview-based podcasts. Some of our favorites are up on there. Folk Roots Radio with Jan Hall, Media Indigena, You're Wrong About.
Some amazing podcasts by Canadian creators as well. Vish Khanna has been doing his podcast for about 600 episodes and has interviewed almost every Canadian musician by now. And then also people starting out like Catherine Fisher, a little newer in the folk scene, but she started a great interview podcast called Wildflower Heart. So all sorts of interview-based podcasts out there. Yeah,
it's about conversation. It's about storytelling. There are also like other formats. What do we have next up there, Sam? Music journalism. So we have focused on music a little bit here to start because this is an event sponsored by the Georgian Bay Folk Society. Dolly Parton's America. This is not a Drake podcast. The ongoing history of new music. Mogul, Lost Notes. All podcasts that are specifically about music. And there's a lot to say about music, whether you're just primarily sharing music like we do with Georgian Bay Roots, whether you're looking at the history, whether you're telling the stories about the people who make it.
Mm-hmm. And here on the music journalism slide, it just shows a few different options you might want to take if you're more into the narrative history of music with your podcast. For example, there are genre-specific ones like This Is Not Drake podcast and Mogul focusing on hip-hop, but Dolly Parton's America is more of a general history of the world that Dolly Parton is a part of. It's taking her music as a starting point and then making a lot of really poignant social commentary. So you can also use that as a launching pad for something else you want to talk about centered around music, if you can take it wherever you want to go.
Mhm.
And niche topics, much like the coin podcast slide you saw earlier, there are any range of niche podcasts, even within purely audio and music. So just as something niche, I chose audio production, which is a really perfect subject for podcasts and audio medium. And I'm sure, has anyone here heard of Song Exploder? Anybody heard that show? That's a very popular podcast where popular musicians, Alicia Keys, Lin-Manuel Miranda, tons of people have done this show now. And they take apart their studio recordings bit by bit and show how they got made. 20,000 Hertz is all about different sounds you're familiar with in your daily life but haven't thought much about. And then Hanging Out with Audiophiles is, again, kind of interview based, but about the history of recording and audio equipment. So you can think about how specific you want to get. Like you were saying, Jarrett, there's a podcast about nearly everything, but you can always get more specific to really carve out what you want to talk about within your topic.
Yeah. Or how you want to talk about it. Song Exploder is similar to, and Song Exploder is like really well known. There's a similar podcast called Strong Songs, where the host as an individual takes apart songs that he thinks are particularly strong and breaks down rhythms and mixes and so even if someone's doing something similar, there's a way for you to do it your way. And yeah, and that's valuable.
Absolutely. And this is something I wanted to talk about this because it's getting increasingly popular, is to have a limited run podcast series that ties into an album release. So a recent one was William Prince. He just released an amazing album called Gospel First Nation. And in the promotional lead up, he released this really refined podcast series called Sunday Verse, which is essentially him telling a story related to a song on the record and then performing the song on that record. And it's a great way, if you have an album coming up and you have an interest in podcasts, just putting something together to maybe show the story behind the album, share some clips of audio from behind the scenes, or maybe make a podcast of people in your community who've inspired you to create that album. There are lots of ways to tie this in. The other example I have up here is called Le Ruban de la Cassette. This is by Anique Granger. And what she did was she made a whole music project based around her podcast where she would interview different people and then have essentially an audio experience of the moment she's doing the interview, her trying out different things in the studio, seeing how they work, sharing ideas with friends, and then finally performing the finished product. And at the end, she released all 10 episodes, the songs that were the product of those episodes as an album. So there's lots to think about how a podcast can work out to an album.
So when it comes to creating a podcast is like kind of creating anything. There are things that you need to do to prepare for it and to focus on what you're going to make to begin with. The end product that you want is going to in some ways be determined by the ingredients that you start off with and the vision that you begin with. If you're going to make a loaf of bread, you know how you're focusing your time in the kitchen. And creative projects like podcasts are similar. So asking yourself to begin with, what is the focus of your podcast? We've just walked through a few slides that shows just a sliver of the breadth of possibilities. And being able to focus is a really important thing. It's easy to do something that might just be like you talking to your friends. And you could record that and you could post that on the internet and promote it and people might listen to it. If there's no focus to it, then it's kind of a long rambling conversation. And if any of you have ever accidentally recorded a conversation with your friends late at night in your youth, you may know that that's not necessarily the easiest thing to consume after the fact, nor perhaps the most interesting thing to anyone else in the world. And podcasts are like that. If you're going to make something that's going to have integrity, even just structural integrity within itself, you need to have a focus. For Georgian Bay Roots, we encapsulate that in our kind of catchphrase that we say in every show, sharing the music made and played in Grey and Bruce counties with folk and roots music from across Canada and around the world. Bam. You know what we're doing, and we know what we're doing. I might have a really great metal song that I want to share, but if it's not made and played in Grey and Bruce counties, I know that it doesn't quite fit the brand, and it's letting people know what's going to be on the menu. It also lets people. Did we let Liv? Yeah, Liv's there. Okay. It also lets folks know what to expect and gives them a reason to keep coming back. We're going to be talking about editing later on, but the question of why would people listen and what's going to keep them coming back is in some ways connected to editing as well, and knowing what you're focusing on and why, how to make that digestible. Sam mentioned that there are limited run podcasts. Like with Georgia May Roots, we're a weekly show. We're a podcast because we're also on the radio. Like those things go together. And so the structure of having a weekly radio spot lets us know that we have to make a show every week. And so we're going to be releasing the show every week. It's built into the structure, and that gives us a structure in which to work as well. We know how long it takes. We know how many shows we need. We can prepare for that.
All right.
Anyone can make a podcast, and one of the questions to ask yourself as you start and as you're in that creative process is what's going to make yours worth listening to. We'll be sharing this slideshow afterwards. I included a hyperlink there to a Friends of Fiddler's Green song called Good Reason Why, which is all about, that song in particular is about needing a good reason to be singing what you're singing, but I think it applies to podcasts too.
That's great, John. Yeah. So now that we've talked a little bit of background about podcasts, I thought I would pause here in case anybody has any questions. Otherwise, we'll get into all the tech stuff behind making a podcast.
And if, like, we've highlighted some podcasts so far, it might be interesting to just go around the room and get a sense from folks of what kinds of podcasts you're listening to and what your favorites are. If folks are down to share that. Skylar, do you have a favorite podcast? Are you a podcast listener?
So yeah, we were briefly talking about this. There's one that I've been listening to for a while. It's called Conversations with People Who Hate Me, which sounds very negative, but it's actually a surprisingly positive show. This guy, he's like an internet personality. He's made like a bunch of different videos and social commentary type stuff for a while. So he gets a lot of hate on the internet, of course, along with a lot of love. So what he does is he reaches out to the people who give him that hate and has like a Skype call or a phone call with them just to talk. Like he doesn't have any like intention of trying to convince them to change an opinion or anything like that. Like he's just like, no, we're just gonna have a conversation and see what comes of it. It's surprisingly interesting.
That's great. I mean,
Okay.
that's the power of a podcast, right? Get two people in a room who wouldn't be in a physical room together probably ever, and see what happens. I'll have to check that one out, Skylar. That sounds good. Does anyone else have a favorite they want to share before we continue?
So
Oh, go ahead.
you go ahead.
Hi, everyone. A podcast that I really love is called The Moth, and it is basically a collection of live stories that people share, and every single one is different because they hardly ever have the same story, like the same person on again. If they do come on a second time, it's with a different life story. And I love that all of them are true to life and are full of heart and sometimes hilarious and sometimes make you just weep. And they're curated to be kind of within some sort of theme. And that's kind of part of what keeps me coming back to it, is always a fresh story and a fresh perspective within a context of what they've put together.
Thanks so much, Liv. Yeah,
Sure.
The Moth is fantastic. And Jared?
I'm definitely going to check that one out that you were talking about, Sky. That sounds super interesting to me. I always have a number of them on the go. And one of my go-tos, obviously, is Alan Cross. I've been listening to him for as long as I can remember. And but right now, I listen to a lot of political ones right now. And but my favorite right now is called Behind the Bastards. And it's basically the story of different people throughout history and obviously it's about people who have terrible people who leave a terrible legacy, which again sounds like it's a negative thing, but they have a really dry sort of sense of humor about it that it makes it enjoyable for some reason. I don't know why. And then the other one I listen to right now is something called Knowledge Fight, which most people would probably not enjoy. But it's basically two people who have been listening to Alex Jones for the last 5 years and breaking down all of his craziness and explaining what's going on behind it. Anyways.
That would be an intense one, I imagine.
You know what? It's hilarious because it takes all the power away from what he's doing, because they're very good at breaking down what he's actually talking about. And it makes you realize how lazy he is.
Right.
He's the laziest content creator of all time.
Well, those are all great. Lots of podcasts about bad people, people we wouldn't want to be in a room with, probably. Well, that's
yeah. Oh yeah.
Does anyone else have any favorites before we carry on?
I like storytelling ones myself. I've got ones that I listen to pretty regularly are the Jan Arden podcast. I've got one right now that if anybody likes stories, Marilyn Lightstone reads. She's a wonderful actress, and she played Miss Stacy on Anne of Green Gables in the miniseries in the 90s. So now she's actually reading the book, Anne of Green Gables. It's just wonderful. But ones that have inspired my own podcasts would be This American Life. I love how they do the 3 acts. And of course, Stuart McLean, Vinyl Cafe. That's probably my favorite of all time. Again, with the stories and the way that he kind of approaches it and has the humanity aspect. I'd say those are probably my favorites.
I love that. The humanity aspect, that's exactly what's at the heart of that work. Yeah. Well, this is great. Let's carry on then. Let's talk about the tech of a podcast a little bit. Unless John, did you want to say a favorite podcast? I guess we've said a few in the earlier part.
I think mine are covered.
All right, let's sally forth here. So you do not need much to make a podcast. It can be very simple. You can make a podcast just with your cell phone. You can make a podcast with a single, SM58 microphone hooked up to your computer. And you can get very fancy, as you can see at some college radio stations. Up here's a picture from CFRU here in Guelph, where you can have a full-on soundboard, you can have multiple mics. So there are various degrees to it. John and I also wanted to show a few pictures of our setups, just to show some of the options that are out there. So you can see in the camera, I'm using some of my podcast equipment tonight. I usually use these headphones, but not always. Headphones can be good because you're monitoring your own voice while you're talking. You know it's recording because it's going into the headphones, but they can also be kind of a barrier between you and the guest, I find. It really formalizes the atmosphere, which is something to consider. I love using a microphone like this. This is an Aston Spirit microphone, and it's really versatile because you can use it just like I'm using it right now as a, just a studio quality mic. But you can also use it. It has a circumference mode where you can have multiple people around it and capture really good audio of a whole circle, a whole group. So sometimes in Toronto, when I couldn't splurge and have multiple microphones, you can see in this picture, I would just get the guests to gather around, and it would be kind of a campfire style conversation circle. You run into different audio problems with that, but it's a way to make a podcast with one microphone in a room.
Yeah. For Georgian Bay Roots, my setup is a USB mic and a computer. That's pretty well that. I've got headphones to listen to while I'm talking. But for interviews over the years, I've used a Tascam or a Zoom recorder, which is just a handheld recorder, and have had some unfortunate learning opportunities with that, like about the importance of windsocks, especially when you're recording outside by Georgian Bay in August at an outdoor music festival where there's a lot of noise and wind. And Sam's going to talk a little bit more about kind of the importance of the quality of your sound. And one of the things that it took me a while to learn was that I need a windsock. And even just literally putting a sock over the microphone, it was my first attempt at that. And it helped enough to get interviews that could be put on the radio. I had interviews with musicians I really admire that I totally ruined by not recording them properly. I'm using the handheld mic in the picture on the left with Benjamin Dakota Rogers. That's recorded at a music industry conference. We've also done live interviews at Summerfolk where we just plugged the recorder into the soundboard. And there have all it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be glamorous. The next slide is maybe the least glamorous I've ever been. My go-to recording setup at home is under a drying rack covered in blankets so that you don't get the bouncing of the sound. This slide is, I was on tour working with a theater company, and I needed to make a radio show, and we were at the Village Inn at Lakefield. And so I put another chair on a table and covered it with a blanket and recorded there so that the sound was just dampened a little bit more. But that's okay. There was a lamp that served double purposes, providing lighting and also holding up the blanket that was dampening the sound. So it doesn't have to be complicated. And how you record your podcast is also going to contribute to the kind of sonic landscape that you're creating and the vibe and brand of your show. And we'll talk more about that after Sam goes into some of the other components.
That's right. John, I love this photo so much. I also like Duff McDonald's enthusiasm. Oh, that's a good idea. I never thought of that.
So I didn't know this photo
comment.
was taken until months later.
It's brilliant. And it showcases how, like John was saying, you can be anywhere. I would say, in terms of equipment, you kind of have what you have with podcasting. You can invest a lot if you have it. Most people don't. Most people have, a bit of money for a microphone maybe, or just want to use what they have around. My biggest expense, I have my Zoom recorder for show and tell here. This was the most money I've spent just for podcasting purposes. And even that, like John said, runs into trouble if you don't have a windsock, if you don't have the right thing hanging around. But I just wanted to mention one of my favorite podcast episodes, for example, was recorded in Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto. We were desperately looking for an indoor space to record, and we simply couldn't find one that day. So I said, hey, to my guest Mingja, why don't we just meet in the park? I've got 2 SM58s. We can just meet there. We'll talk into those. And it ended up being one of my favorite episodes because our conversation was enlivened by the sounds of the outdoors, of people moving around. And we could also talk a little bit about what we see. Podcasts are an audio medium. So if you're going to put people in a place, you have to really describe what's going on, either in a story or in your environment. So that's something to think about too, where you are, how you can use the space. Like John running around with a microphone at a folk conference or at Summerfolk. You can get a lot from just the space that you're in.
I did an interview with David Newland once in his canoe while he was paddling us around, and at different points you could hear the paddle dipping into the water and the music bouncing off of different parts of the festival site. And I really want to echo what Sam said around you're creating an environment. So there are times when you're recording at home maybe and you want it to just be your audio and to just have your voice filling that space, but you can literally bring people to a place by recording in it, and that can be really powerful.
Oh, there are the last couple things I wanted to say in case anybody's recording an interview over the phone or over Zoom. Just a couple of things to keep in mind there. This is something I really struggled with when I started trying to make a podcast remotely, because I love bringing guests in. And most of the examples John and I are talking about, you're with the guest, you're in the canoe with the guest, you can talk right to them.
Pre-COVID,
yeah. So this is especially pertinent now. But there are a few different ways you can do it. The best way is if you can convince your guest to use a microphone in their own space that they're comfortable with, if they have a preamp and a microphone. Most guests will be open to doing that, especially if they're musicians. Another option, of course, you can just record a Zoom call, but you get a lot of lag from that, as we all know, from being on Zoom all the time. So even if your guest
or background noise too. I just recorded one on Zoom, and we could hear a computer, and we didn't re-record the interview. It went to air, but it's it's a risk. Sorry to interrupt, Sam.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, you can't control those things. So a step up from that, your guest could just use their phone too if they have an iPhone or a BlackBerry with a voice recorder, which can be a step up because if you lag, you still get the proper audio, but like John said, you can still get the space noise. And then there are also phone-based apps. So if you're on a phone call, you can use something like, there's an app called Tape a Call, which will allow you to capture the audio on the other side, which is a bit more reliable than something like Zoom audio. So just a few options.
Full disclosure, I've also just taken my Zoom recorder and sat in a car with Bluetooth and done a call on the car, like in the car on the phone with Bluetooth.
You're so brave, John. Wow.
See my episode interviewing Richard Garvey.
All right, so let's get into elements, why don't we? So the components of a podcast, what makes a great podcast? Number one, and I'm so excited about this part, I pulled some audio examples that we can listen to together. So we're gonna have a little listening party. So arguably the most important audio you're going to import into your podcast is your theme music, because this is something that probably repeats every week. It shows the vibe of your show. It welcomes your audience. It tells them about the genre, what your target market is as a podcast. So I thought we would listen to a few of these and just think about what kind of tone are they setting for the podcast we're listening to.
Today on Live Awake, it's time to remember now your innate wisdom.
Okay, so someone who's never heard Live Awake, what do you think that podcast is? What do you think they're going to be talking about?
Kind of meditative and makes you relax.
Yeah, and contemplative too.
I also was like, oh, it's like lullaby-ish. I'm going to fall asleep now and be very relaxed. Sorry, it's not a diss.
Those are great. Those are exactly right. I mean, Kimmer with meditative, that's it. It's a meditation podcast. So this theme song is clearly doing its job. It lets you know exactly what it's going for. I wanted to contrast that with this here.
Welcome back to Freedom.
We're here.
All right.
Freedom!
Oh, no, stop.
Freedom!
Okay, you can stop. Okay. Oh. So, what kind of show does everyone think that is now that you've heard it a few times?
I honestly have no idea, but it's exciting.
Sounds like a comedy show to me.
You got it. It's a comedy show. That's a great inference. So, yeah, typically if you're doing a comedy show, you're thinking high energy. What can we do that's quick, gets people immediately? And usually they crack jokes and laugh during the theme song, so you know what you're getting into. Just one other option I wanted to showcase was this from 20,000 Hertz.
You're listening to 20,000 Hertz. After just 1 second, you might be able to guess what this is. It has introduced thousands of films. And for millions of people, it means one thing. It's movie time.
So I wanted to share that one because it's showing that without a concrete theme song, and 20,000 Hertz doesn't have one, you can use music at the start of your show to set the tone. In this case, it's very authoritative. You know it's going to be about something you're familiar with. And just for fun, I won't share Lyrically Speaking in the, for time, but
Yes,
George and
I would
Bay.
like to hear it.
Okay. Well, here are a few seconds. I did want to say, in making theme music for your podcast, I find it very important to pay someone enough money to make something that you feel really good about if you have the resources and you don't want to do it yourself or you can't. So I worked with my friend Jojo Worthington to make this. based on a demo I did. And I had a little bit of money so we could go back and forth and really get something right for the show. So I highly recommend taking the time to do that. And this is what we came to.
How do you determine when you've sort of arrived?
The songs that I've been writing, when I write again and again.
Words we're using.
I have my own way to go, my own songs and my own.
I've thought very deeply about the lyrics.
Art is about human expression.
Lyrically speaking.
Lyrically speaking.
So I thought it was very important for my podcast to have actual clips of voices to let you know this is an interview podcast. It's going to be thoughtful. So there's Joni Mitchell in there. There's Kendrick Lamar. I took a bunch of little clips of voices to integrate into the show. And then we have a special guest in the audience featured in this theme song. So I'll let us listen to Georgian Beirut's here.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1.
Hello, friends. My name is Kaylee Jane Hawkins, and this is Georgian Beirut's, the official radio show of the Summerfolk Music and Crafts Festival here on AM 560 CFOS on Sundays at 4, on Blues and Roots Radio on Tuesdays and Fridays, or anywhere, anytime, online at SoundCloud, via podcast, and at summerfolk.org/Georgian Beirut's.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Woo! What I love about that one, that's another option to come in during the theme song with obviously talking over it. And just the energy of Kaylee's voice there combined with the energy of the music. You know the genre, you know what kind of energy level you're getting into, and you just want to be taken there. So that's something to consider about theme music. John, did you want to add anything there?
Can I, sorry,
No,
Sam, can I ask a question?
Oh, sure, of course.
So you've got clips of people in yours as an example. Do people need to worry about copywriting or any sort of legalese that we should be careful of doing stuff like that?
I sought out the advice of my librarian mother, actually, who's done some copyright work. Not too much, but the general thought is if it's a short enough clip that it's barely recognizable, these are taken from archived YouTube videos too. So for something like that, it's not really of grave concern. It might be a little bit different if this was a really high profile podcast. Then it's something to consider because the person might actually contact you. For something localized, I'm not too concerned about it. But something to keep in mind for the actual, if you're including, say, a full song as background music in your podcast, that's something I've always dealt with by not dealing with it. But if this were a higher profile podcast, I would. So it's a great question. I don't know if you have any insights on that, John. I think it's a little different because we're both running through campus radio, so we report the music that we play.
Yeah, and so that those, like the music that we play, like the clip at the start of Georgian Beirut's is part of a song by the Ducks called Lazy John, and we include that in, like, it's part of our play log every week. So those musicians, because we go through a radio station, they're reporting the plays, and so they're getting paid their royalties based on that airplay.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that when it's through a radio station, it's very easy because you can simply report it. Even if it's just a background song, you can report it. But if it's an independent podcast, it's a little more challenging to make sure creators are paid and recognized for their work. So that's a great, thank you for bringing that up. I'm sorry I don't have more information outside of campus, a radio context. Cool, and anybody interrupt at any time, that's great if anybody has any questions. All right, hooks and stings. So I wanted to talk a little bit about two very important things to consider integrating into your podcast. A hook, basically, what's the very first audio they hear if it's not your theme song? A lot of the times you'll hear a podcast that starts with a little clip of, say, an interview that's done within the podcast that really intrigues you and gets your attention. So I pulled an example from Politically Reactive, a political interview-based podcast.
How did you get into politics? What made you decide that was the way to go?
But one day I just lost my mind and decided to run.
From Topic Studios and Warner Media Podcast Network.
So you can see with something like that, it doesn't have to be long. It can be 6 to 10 seconds. And this is what I do on Lyrically Speaking too. It's just take a moment that you find it's kind of representative of what the listener is about to hear and put it right at the start. Stings are musical cues in any kind of broadcast. So you'll hear this on, say, the evening news when you hear do-do-do-do, and then it's 6 o'clock, here's the news. But this can be used in podcasts in all sorts of ways. One example is to have a recurring sound effect that adds personality or character to your podcast. So this is from a podcast by comedian Jamie Loftus called My Year in Mensa. She uses a lot of video game sounds to punctuate her points. Oh.
So the last long form.
Sorry?
I just totally talked over that. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
She's often a co-host on Behind the Bastards.
No way. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay.
All the time.
I'll have to check that out for sure. That's amazing. She's great. But here's how she uses these video game stings.
Kind of story that I want to do is something I've seen before, and maybe you'll recognize it too. It kind of goes like, so I met these people who have absolutely terrible views on just about everything, and it turns out they're pretty nice. This happens weirdly a lot.
So she just uses that sound to punctuate a comedic bit. And in a very different way, this podcast called The Working Songwriter, which is another interview-based podcast, uses some transitional music between segments. You'll hear this a lot. Georgian Bay Roots does this as well, having segments that transition with some kind of clear music. So we're just going to hear a transition from a spoken word poem back into an interview.
Give me back my young brother, hard and furious, with wide shoulders and a curse for God, and burning eyes that look upon all creation and say, you can have it. So I was, in getting ready for this interview, I stumbled on this really, really crazy fact about.
So you can see, in that case, it's really using a bit of space. It's letting you digest the spoken word piece you just heard by having a longer sting, a longer transition into a new segment. So those are hooks and stings. And this leads into segments. John, do you want to talk about segments a little bit?
Yeah, so depending on the format of the thing that you're creating, if you're having, it's hard to have a single component be the full length of a podcast if it's going to be just like 30 minutes of one conversation. Or like an hour of that. It's going to be maybe a lot, and there's not going to be much variation there. In the same way that when you're painting, you're going to choose maybe at least two different colors to provide some depth and variation. This creating audio is similar. You get to use different either recurring segments to have a part of the show that people can look forward to, that's its own self-contained little brand that can also bridge between different components in your show, or even just to kind of add a little bit of flavor there. Like the segment can be, it can be the pickle on your burger, or it can be the bacon of your BLT. Like they can be big, they can be small, and they're going to help to set the tempo for the thing that you're creating by having those breaks in there. it can also help, again, to add structure to the thing that you're creating. If you know that every week you're going to have 5 minutes of this particular thing, or there's going to be 30 seconds of X or Y, it helps helps you to bridge and lets you know what to plan for. Variation is the spice of a podcast, to quote my good friend Sam Boer. I think of, maybe if any of you listen to Canada Land, there's a segment on their, one of their shows called Duly Noted, where just it's like a minute and a half maybe, where each of the people who are hosting the show just say like their opinion on something. It's a thing that they do no matter who's hosting. It's just a small thing, but it's also a way to include more variation into what you're doing. We had for a while a segment called Bob's Vinyl Spins in Georgian Bay Roots, and that segment got its own theme music. So when I don't know if if we can click on that and cue that up, or if we're running out of time this way.
Let me just get.
Well, before.
Somewhere around 44. Yeah.
On tour, Rob.
Pine Leaf Boys with. I had a great time in New Orleans, but we wish we had spent a bit more time checking out the Cajun music in Lafayette. Guess that'll have to be for another trip.
Bob's Vinyl Spins.
Well, here it is, folks. Bob's Vinyl Spins, where local raconteur Robert Menzies.
In every episode that Dylan and Lauren were doing towards the end of their run as hosts, they had another Summerfolk volunteer named Bob who would bring a single track, talk about it, and play it. It lets you also add to the kind of flavor of your show, and you can use that as a like Sam just talked about, hooks and stings as well, to make it fun, to let people know what they're in for.
Yeah, I love that segment. There's so much personality in this segment. I want to talk a little bit about audio editing too, which is something to keep in mind. You can use all sorts of different digital audio workstations for audio editing. That's just up to your preference. I use Logic for my editing. I've also used Adobe Audition in the past. But regardless of what you're using, you want to edit the right amount. And I think a lot of people, when they get the gist of editing, can go a little bit editing happy and cut out too much of their show. So there's a fine line I want to talk about here. Here's an example of editing too much. I want you to listen. This is from, not throwing shade, but this is from Armchair Expert by Dax Shepard. And they get great guests. This is with Aubrey Plaza. And one thing that this podcast has gotten known for is editing out a lot of the breaths, a lot of the pauses, and a lot of the moments that make talking human. And you'll hear the effect of that.
Ultimatum.
Okay, great. Great. And so Jeff, who you've been with for, 8 years now?
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys have done 2 movies together.
3.
3?
He's done 3 movies. I've been in all of his movies.
Oh, okay.
But Joshy, I was a very small part in. Life After Beth was his first movie, then Joshy, then Little Hours.
So I've found when talking to people who are a couple.
Did anybody hear it? How weird it was? It's just very cringeworthy, eh? And that's just getting a little too happy with trying to shorten your episode down. There are moments that you just want to let breathe. I wanted to contrast that with this portion of Song Exploder. What Song Exploder does that is pretty special is they only let their guests speak. The interviewer's voice is never heard. So here you're just going to hear Laura Marling talk about her own work, edited, I think, very elegantly.
This is the longest I've ever taken to write a record. You know, I started very young. I put out my first album when I was 17, and I'm now 30. When I was young, in a really wonderful way, and I think everybody experiences this when they're young, you're kind of a functioning narcissist. in that you have this experience of the world in which you are the central character. And I think that's wonderful, because I think that is full of color and vibrancy, and it's a very necessary experience when you're young. But there was maybe an accumulation of events that led to this sort of next rite of passage as a person.
I love that, because you hear those moments of life. You hear the pause before but. You hear a pause before as a person. And suddenly it's like there's a person in the room with you. It's not just a disembodied voice. So keep that in mind when you're editing any kind of audio for your podcast or anything. And the last component I'm going to talk about is background music and sound, which can really bring your podcast to life. I wanted to share a very famous moment from Radiolab. I'm sure a lot of you, who's heard of Radiolab out there? Probably most folks, eh? Amazing show. And they did a very famous episode called Colors, which showcased how different animals see color in the world. And I think it's just a masterclass in using sound to creatively tell your story. So we're just going to listen to that here.
So if a butterfly were looking at a rainbow... I never thought we'd get here.
Well, they do, I'm sure. I mean, butterflies are out there when the rainbows are out. But with sea colors, we have no names for between the blues and the greens and the greens and the yellows. Ooh.
So it would go from ultraviolet, it would see that.
Yep.
Then it would see violet.
And then blue.
And then blue, blue, green.
Yep.
And green, green, bluey, bluey, or whatever.
Right.
And then orange and red and all that.
Yep. They have very complicated eyes.
Huh.
Okay, so just to recap.
All right.
Here's the dog. Here's us, humans. Now the sparrow. A little bit more bass, a little bit more high end, so to speak. And finally, the butterfly. Which is, not so far above the sparrow, but it's got more mids in there.
Isn't that amazing? I love Jad Abumrad saying, it's not too different, but it has a few more mids in there. Just incredible. So using a choir to illustrate this kind of, abstract biological fact of perceiving color. It's an audio medium, so you can get super creative with how you present the information you're presenting. In a more subtle way, here's a bit from Lyrically Speaking, where I was interviewing a guest who had a virtual reality world made to accompany his album. So he's talking a little bit about his favorite moments of that. And I put the songs in that he's discussing just to liven the discussion a little bit, put the listener in that place.
I got emotional at two parts. One was Unknown, which is like right in the middle of the record. And it's this sort of island scene that's out in the middle of nowhere, like relative to the main island. And just the colors that she used in the way she built up the landscape, and it was particularly true to like what Quinn Henderson had done in real life paintings, and it was just so amazing. But kind of on the flip side of that, with the last track, she just made this really strange, beautiful, like heaven, like just an amazing landscape that was very loosely based off of stuff that I'd floated her way and from Quinn's stuff, and it just turned into something that it's not like it captured my vision, it captured something beyond that, you know what I mean? That's when it's really exciting, like from a collaborative standpoint.
So you can see how without the music, it would have been, pretty difficult to picture what he was talking about, but that does put you in the space a little bit more. All right, into branding. John, you want to take this one?
Spoiler, like everything is branding. In the same way that how you, if you were an actor, the way that you dress yourself and carry yourself, and the makeup that's on you, and the words that you use create the character. What you choose for theme music and editing styles and the recording atmosphere and the visuals that go along with how you promote your podcast to the world is all creating a picture of what this is and we'll tell people the character of the thing that you're creating, and of you as a creator in that, through the lens of that project. It helps to be consistent. It lets people know what to expect, and it lets you know what you're creating there before you step on stage as the character of that podcast creator. I may be mixing metaphors here a lot, but it's all performance, and it's how you present this thing to the world, no matter what platform people are finding it, whether it's through the earbuds that they're listening to you, or whether it's what they're scrolling past on social media, or the website that you create, or and everything in between. Sam, I'll leave Ira to you.
Yeah, I just love this Ira Glass quote, which you can read on the screen. But he often says in a book I'll also plug later called Out on the Wire, which is a comic about podcasting, this little graphic novel, in that he says the key is to express your own personality again and again. It's not going to be interesting to listen to someone who isn't expressing something about themselves. So you got to be vulnerable in the way that you host or produce a show.
Yeah, try being yourself. It's probably going to be great.
You might enjoy it. Yeah, it might be pretty fun.
We've talked about audio, but there are different things that go into creating a podcast. It requires a lot, from curation to figuring out what you're going to be sharing and how does it all fit together. That's particularly clear if you're talking about something like Georgian Bay Roots, which is primarily a music sharing vehicle. We pick different themes, and whether the theme is new stuff that I love or all songs that start with the number 2, we are tasked with quilting sonically together these things. So figuring out what we want to share in that. If you're doing an interview-based podcast or a conversation-based podcast, you've got to curate the moments as well, unless you have unlimited time. To do any of that curation, it also takes research. So asking yourself, like, of the things that you're sharing, where are you finding them? For Georgian Bay Roots, we write, or I anyway, in my approach to it, write scripts. Interviews are not scripted, but everything else is. Even if it's a 30-second or 10-second description of a song between 2 songs, I write that out so that I don't have a lot of ums and ahs and have to re-record it 8 billion times to try to sound cohesive. So scripts, really helpful. But that also takes time. And bringing all these pieces together, again, takes time and intention. And that's where something like basic, like scheduling, is so important. Like, do you have enough time to create the thing that you're wanting to create on the timeline that you've given yourself? Do you know how long it's going to take to do that interview or to do the editing? Do you know what it's going to take to do the graphic and post that? Like, all of these things take planning. We're going to talk more about interviewing. And I've given kind of a fast pass over these things. Sam, what should we dig more deeply into just on this slide?
I wanted to say about scheduling, just a story from my own experience. I tried to do a weekly show. Analytics show typically it's best to have a weekly show just to maintain a listenership. In theory, the best show is 22 minutes and a weekly podcast, but obviously there's huge variation in that. That's just what tends to keep listeners the most. So I thought my show would be a weekly show. I was like, oh, it's no problem. I'll schedule a guest each week, do an interview, edit a show together, send it out to CFRU and send it out as a podcast. And that was way too much time. It's a huge commitment as one person with no money for doing it. So it went to a bi-weekly podcast. And then I started school again and I realized, oh, it's really hard to do a podcast every 2 weeks. And I changed it to a monthly podcast. And that's okay. When you're starting out, you might not be able to anticipate how much everything will take. But I'd highly recommend making a couple of pilot episodes and really calculating how much time it's taking you. So you don't want to get into something you can't sustain.
The worst episode I ever made, I didn't give myself enough time. In the first year of the show, I was doing a weekly show, and we had a grant through Summerfolk to do that. And generally, it was taking me like kind of 2 hours each night for like 4 or 5 nights a week. And I had a week that was really busy, and it was like I had a bunch of other work piled up, and I tried to do it in a 4-hour chunk one morning, and I just made a bunch of mistakes, and it sounded not good. And I never want to put something out into the world like that again. And it was a learning experience, but also it was totally my bad for having not scheduled that properly.
Mm-hmm. But let's talk a little bit more about what I've learned a lot about this from John, the master interviewer. Interviewing.
Yeah, the first step is to be prepared. Assuming that you're doing a focused interview, that you might also do something where you're just meeting random people on the street. We'll get to that. Those kind of tips are maybe farther down in the slide. But if you're interviewing someone because you specifically want to talk to them, you need to be prepared. Something as basic as knowing how to pronounce their name, or knowing where they're from and the name of their latest album, for the case of a music podcast. To not do that can really sidetrack your interview, and you can end up asking questions that aren't interesting, that are your boilerplate kind of questions. I've had conversations with James Keelan about this, who is the artistic director of Summerfolk and also a singer-songwriter in his own right, who has told me stories about being at stations and doing interviews where people ask questions like, what can they expect when they come to your show? It's like, well, it's a concert, so probably music. It's just not it's not an informed enough question. And in order to really get to something interesting, you've got to know enough about that person, not to know what they're going to say, but to know what your jumping off points are, kind of like where the threads are that you can pull on. In order for that to be possible, you've got to be friendly. You got to be nice. Unless it sounds like Jared is partial to some podcasts that might be about people arguing with each other. But if that's your vibe, go with that. But for the kind of podcast that Sam and I do, you got to be friendly and to stay calm, right? As part of that, to not get super worked up, because if you're stressing out, people pick up on that vibe, and it comes through in your audio as well. So you might not be creating the kind of thing that you want to. One thing that I'm really still trying to learn is to ask one question at a time and leave room for an answer. I am the best at asking 6 questions that make someone go, wait, what? Just be clear. And that doesn't mean that you have to have your list of questions and kind of rapid fire them. Interviewing someone is so much a dance. Like, it's something that you are creating together. You are collaborating on this interview. And that also means being able to pay attention to where they're going in their conversation, to see the things that they might be bringing up that you hadn't thought of or didn't know about that are interesting. And to even say something as simple as, can you tell me more about that? Is part of that volley back and forth, so that the person that you're interviewing has something to work with, which requires you to be ready to throw away all the preparation and the planning that you did. And in all of this, it's so important, like Sam quoted Ira Glass earlier, to be yourself, to not be pretending to be someone else or be trying to mimic something, unless that's like your thing. But you can just be yourself, or the character that you're playing. And I guess, as I say character, one of the great Canadian examples is Nardwuar, as someone who has made a career of interviewing people in really strange kind of ways through that character of Nardwuar, the human serviette. But he also is so prepared for interviews that he shows up knowing things about the people that he interviews, that it's like, how did you know the name of my 8th grade teacher, or whatever that is? Or where did you get that first screen printed run of 3 t-shirt from the first show I ever played at a church basement? Like, Nardwuar is Nardwuar, and has been really successful because of that.
I just saw a question.
Best example I've ever seen of that was Nardwuar interviewing Wu-Tang Clan. Because the amazing thing is, he knew so much about how geeked out they were on kung fu movies, that he gets them to start turning into kung fu movie geeks, and their kind of street sort of drops away a little bit until one of them realizes what's happening, and they immediately turn the street back on. But it is hilarious to watch. It's the most amazing interview I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Which, and that's Nardwuar being able to like lay out the breadcrumbs and dance with those folks through like into a place where they would have never gone on their like third interview of the day on a normal press circuit. How, like, where you choose to and how you choose to connect with someone is going to shape the interview. There's so much that's going to set that possibility up for the person that you're interviewing as well. You're inviting them to be a guest in this thing that you're creating. You've got to be able to be hospitable with that as well in setting tone and place and all of that.
I'm just conscientious of time. I notice we have, I think, 15 minutes left. Is that right, Skylar? Okay, so we want to leave some time for questions, so we might have to zoom through just the last bit here. Pardon the pun. I just wanted to say that last thing about interviewing, I do a lot of in-person interviews, and one of my tenets is always offer tea before you do the interview. It doesn't have to be tea, but you want to make the person feel at home. I love this quote from podcaster Keith Talbot. Doing an interview is like hosting a party. It's your party, and your guests will follow your lead as to how to act. If you're nervous, they'll be nervous. So always keep that in mind with interviews. In terms of sharing your podcast, there are tons of options for this. My experience is with Squarespace, which is if you have a website with them, you can share your podcast automatically, and they upload it to almost every platform. But there's so many different options about this. If anyone has specific questions, we can talk about it. One huge trend is Patreon, which I'm sure you all have heard a little bit about, which is an excellent way to make money for your podcast and share it to a very specific audience. It's a very easy to use platform. So yeah, we can talk about that more in the question section if you'd like.
Building an audience, you can make, if we go through this hypothetically, you've already made something that's amazing. Now the question is, how do you share that? Uploading that to a platform is the necessary first step, but then building your audience can involve so many different things, from just telling your friends that you've got a podcast and making something great, and then the people who love it will tell other people that they love it, to using social media in any way. You could even take out ads for your podcast if you wanted to. You can make t-shirts, you can make stickers. We made buttons for Georgian Bay Roots. Having a website so that people know where to go to find that thing, and cross-posting either on different platforms, connecting with other people that are doing it. Jarrett gave a reference to someone who has their own podcast, but it also appears on other podcasts. All of that makes it easier for you to be found. And there's so many ways to do that. But the necessary first ingredient is to have a thing and have something that's of sufficient quality that other people will want to say, this is amazing for these reasons. I think you would like it too.
And last but not least, make it sustainable. So all things to keep in mind. We can talk about this more in the Q&A if you'd like, but there's so many costs involved with podcasts, especially time costs. And there are also many options for sources of income. Again, Patreon is huge. Ads, even things like creative control with Vish Khanna, which we referenced earlier. He got sponsorships from very local places, from Dad's Donuts, this small independent donut place, The Bookshelf, a little bookstore and cinema in Guelph. And I'm sure they're paying him, maybe $15 an episode, or giving him a bag of donuts per episode. But there's these little ways that you can connect with your community too, and make yourself a little bit more legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
And
like any startup, it's going to cost you more at the start than it does later on, and you should expect that.
Yeah. And I just want to offer, if you want to learn more, there are tons of podcasts about podcasting too. One that I like is The Wolf Den, which is about a particular podcasting company. There are dozens of these. Podcasting Q&A is pretty good. And the best way to learn is, like the sign says, experience. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if anyone has any questions, we'd love to hear it, or just chat about what you're thinking about.
I had a question come to my mind when you were talking about interviewing. And for something I had happen recently was I let someone know that, or we arranged to have an interview, and then they asked if I could send them the questions ahead of time. In each of your experiences, I'm not sure if you've found that to be more fruitful, or if the answers feel a bit too stiff, or how that kind of, if they ask for it, maybe that is just a better thing to do because that's what they need. Yeah, it kind of leaves room for, or leaves less room for that collaboration or that spontaneity. So I didn't know, in your experience, what's happened in those situations.
Sam, do you want to take that to begin with?
Sure, that's a great question, Liv. It reminds me of something else Ira Glass writes in that book, which is he's asked that same question, and he always says, you want to let your guests know exactly what they're getting into. You don't want to shock them or surprise them. That's a lot of what investigative journalism does, what quick interviews on TV do, is they set you up to feel uncomfortable and then reveal something you don't want to. What a good podcast does is it sets you up to feel comfortable enough to reveal something you already wanted to say. So if you let your guests know, we're going to be talking about this and this, is there something you don't want to talk about? Is there a particular area that's really special to you? That's great. But I think once you send a particular question, I've done that with my podcast once, and it was not my favorite interview because it did feel, like you said, a little bit stiff.
I like that. So being a little bit more like vague in what you, not vague, but like broad, I guess, in how you present what will be options during the interview.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it.
I have one thing to say to that, Liv. I recently did an interview for Rogers Television with someone, and they asked me for the questions ahead of time because they are, bless them, they're ramblers. They go on and on and on, and we had a very specific time frame that we had to work within. We didn't have any flexibility with that. So I did send them the questions ahead of time to make sure, A, that they were comfortable with everything that we were going to touch on, and B, so that they had an opportunity to kind of develop a response. So it didn't feel maybe as genuine in like that kind of, for lack of a better word, like the shoot the shit kind of conversation, if you will. But what it did do is it just gave them an idea, a way to focus in their answers, because this person, bless their heart, is a huge rambler, and so to rein them in, it was a really great tool for them. So I would say that, like, for some of your people that you are interviewing, if that's something that they are really aware of about themselves, it would be a great way to help segue, like to help ensure that they're not rambling on for way past the time frame that you've got available for them. You know what I mean? So yeah.
There are, in most of the interviews that I've done, there's been a sense going in that, like, hey, like, I was thinking of asking about these things. Is there anything else I should make sure to ask? But even if you have told someone exactly the questions you're going to ask, the way that you deliver them can still create a sense of natural conversation. Even in thinking about reading an introduction, if you've written out an introduction or they've sent you a bio, the way that you deliver that can still be in a way that is natural and fluid and creates that space for comfort and open sharing.
So maybe would a good solution for something like that, like either that the person coming on needs help focusing, or they've requested the questions, maybe if you just sort of provide the areas so that you're going to touch on, and not necessarily the exact wording, the exact questions, so that they don't necessarily have a sort of pre-planned response, but they do understand that you're going to touch on this area and that area. Am I making sense? I think I'm making sense.
Yeah, different people need different things. And that's part of negotiating and doing the setup for that conversation as well. They might just be really like anxious and be worried about like not saying the right thing or not sounding the way that they want to. And other people might be really private. Like there's so many different scenarios. It's just about being flexible as a host. And if you're not the kind of person, if you don't go in with a plan, or you don't want to tell them for whatever reason, maybe you're not going to end up interviewing that person, and that's okay too.
Yeah, this is all great. I'll also say it's very different if you're pre-recording versus recording live, because live sometimes you really have to flex that skill of cutting someone off while not looking like a jerk. Which
that was going to be my next question: is how do you get out of that situation?
You have to be very firm in your conviction as a host. For example, John, can you talk incoherently to me for a minute?
Sam, I don't know if I'm ready to talk incoherently. I did that one time, but it wasn't the best. I think I was maybe, was it high school? Was it middle school? It could have been high school. No, I think it might have been.
I did want to ask you a little bit about high school, because I know you went to Ramblers High School up on the hill, right? So why don't we, so you can do something where you just take a bit of what they're saying that can loop it back and get right back into the interview.
That's fantastic.
Thank you, John.
I like how you weren't prepared to ramble.
Actually, a little known fact, I was born a rambling man, trying to make a living and doing the best I can.
Big reveal from John. Does anyone else have any other questions, comments, things they're thinking about?
I do have another question.
Great.
I feel like I'm just sort of the only one talking, but
oh, that's great.
The approaching people to request interviews. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to create sort of a live interview and performance show. Nothing too long. And now that you sort of suggested the 22-minute run thing, that's kind of where my brain is thinking at now. I was thinking somewhere around the 15 minutes kind of thing. Think about like a shortened version of House of Strombo, cool, where somebody comes in, they play a few songs, answer a few questions, play a couple more songs, and then you're done. But I need to start being able to reach out and ask people for interviews. I've never done that. I've been on the other end of it, but I've never had to do that. Is there any strategies?
That's a great question. John, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, email, phone, social media. Like, just reach out and have your pitch. Like, hey, I'm starting a podcast. It's about this. I'd really love you to be on it. This is the kind of structure and what I'm thinking. Like if you're into that, let me know. Like, would you consider it? Just ask.
I have I love that, John. I'm a little more formal in my my approach. I think, that's just who I am. But one thing I developed is an FAQ sheet that I send out to guests. So I have a 2-pager that answers every possible guest question, which, like John said, being more casual, some guests much prefer that. But I found that having an FAQ where you say, here's what it'll look like, here's where it is, when it airs, you will not be paid, or you'll be paid this. Every possible question they might have, as well as why would you do this? And I always had a little segment about, we're a humble little podcast, but we do get this many listeners per week on average, and it'll allow us to cross promote this work and this work. Happy to send that too if you want, just to have an example.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind that at all.
That sounds way more professional than what I do.
I don't know why. And every guest is different, like John said. If you know your guest is like not going to look at that, then just don't worry about it. You can tell who would appreciate that.
Yeah.
It depends too on how you're connecting. Like, in thinking, Sam, about the outreach that you need to do, especially during COVID. Most of my interviews over the last little while have been with people that I know. And when it's at the festival or at like a music conference, there's a context already there where it's mutually understood. So we can say like, we're at Summerfolk, I'm with Summerfolk's radio show, and and the media liaison person just gave you this like request for an interview. So it's totally different depending on your context.
That was a great question, though. Thank you. I meant to touch on that anyways, so that's perfect. Cool. Any other
Freedom,
thoughts?
did I see you going for your mic a little while ago? No, there was no question. Okay, I thought I saw a yeah. Nope, just putting him on the spot.
I just have one last quick question then. I because it's so difficult to get together with people now, what's the best format for doing remote
interviews?
Yeah.
So yeah, like I touched on earlier, you do have a lot of different options. I'm curious, John, how do you do remote interviews? How have you done those?
I've done remote interviews a lot of different ways. Like I said, one time I just sat in my car with a recorder. I have participated in remote interviews by recording with my own setup on my end and then having a Zoom call with the other person. And then I had to send them my audio that I had recorded with my setup, and they stitched that together so that you get the highest possible quality and yeah, on that end. And yeah, like I haven't used phone-based systems, but it's generally been either directly in Zoom or use like I've also just and I think Kaylee's done this too. Having a speaker, your phone on speaker, and having it beside your mic, and there are so many ways to kind of cobble together the technology. I've never done it in a way that I would call professionally trained. So I'm interested to hear from Sam.
I would say, you love those high frequencies of a phone held up to a condenser microphone. I've done that as well. But yeah, I'd highly recommend, especially if you're working with musicians, they probably have a mic, a preamp. And most people are game to just set it up and record their voice while they talk to you. So I'd encourage that if you can. While you have a Zoom call, have microphones going, something like that.
I was going to say, is Zoom reliable enough?
Zoom is not great. Ideally, it will be like what I do when I'm on a Zoom call is I have my microphone going into my Zoom. Well, this is hard, right? Because there's Zoom and Zoom. Going into my Zoom recorder.
This is quickly becoming a Mazda commercial.
Yeah. And then we talk on Zoom on a computer separately. So you can use the Zoom audio in a pinch, but it's ideally you're talking through a microphone.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to see what you create. I hope this this inspires it.
I think it's going to be something pretty fun.
Amazing.
We'll see. I'm sure, like most things, it's going to start out pretty rough and then get better.
Like everything.
Yeah,
totally.
I don't recommend my first like handful of episodes. Learning is hard, but that's okay too.
I started listening to podcasts in like 2006, 2007, and the quality of what is available now versus what was happening then is night and day.
Oh yeah.
Like it was, a lot of them were kind of unlistenable, and yeah, and now there's so much to enjoy. It's pretty crazy. It's kind of like a golden age.
Yeah, we're very lucky right now. So yeah, and if anybody has any other questions, we talked to Skylar before about sending out our emails, and feel free to get in touch if you're working on something and you want to check in. I love hearing works in progress too, so please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and you can get in touch with us by looking up the names of our podcasts and
Right on.
But yeah, I think that we'll call it a close probably. If everyone's feeling good, ready to go into the night, I'm going to go listen to a podcast right now probably, and have a bath probably. So if anybody feels like making the most of their evening with a podcast, now's the time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much to John for being an amazing co-host, and to Skylar for putting this together. This was really fun, and I miss Summer Folk.
Sam, thank you for sharing all your knowledge.
Yeah, huge
And,
thanks to both
props
of
to
you
Sam.
for doing this.
Sam is mostly responsible for the slideshow and the integration of audio and visual materials into that. So thank you for that as well.
I'm to blame for making this more academic than it perhaps needed to be.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
now you get to go wash the notes off your feet.
What were you going to say there, Liv?
Oh, I just said thank you so much. This was great. I'm glad I could come for part of it.
Thanks, Liv. I'm glad you could make it too. It was so fun seeing all of you and hanging out tonight.
Very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you for coming, and thanks for all your good work on Georgian Bay Roots.
Thank you for using the example. I'm not going to lie. I feel pretty chuffed.
It was great. Yeah, a great hosting character to your voice. It's perfect.
Can you hear Jeffrey?
Yes. Jeffrey agreed.
All right. Wow, Jeffrey is going nuts. Skylar, are there any? Is this the last one in the series? Are there any more?
It is, yeah. This was a super fun note to end it on too, I must say. This was really good. And again, thanks to both of you for co-hosting this, and thanks to those of you who came out tonight, especially those of you who have been here for the entirety of the series. I hope you got out of it what you were hoping to, and yeah, I hope you learned a lot and are excited to jump into more digital things.
Very much so.
Amazing.
Great series, Skylar.
Yeah, this was fantastic.